You're listening to Think Deep,
a podcast by the Deep-Ocean Stewardship Initiative.
We are a global network of experts
working at the intersection of science,
policy, and community
to guide stewardship of the deep ocean.
Through engagement with policymakers,
building global capacity,
and fostering collaboration.
Our core team and ambassadors
help shape policies that protect deep ocean ecosystems,
which are vital to sustaining life on Earth.
Join us as we dive into the science,
governance, and stories shaping the future of our ocean.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Think Deep, decoding deep ocean science and policy. In this podcast series, we're taking you behind the scenes to explore how scientific research influences decisions, laws, and protections for the deep ocean. Join us as we dive into the science, the challenges, and the people working toward a sustainable ocean future. I'm your host, Michelle Gurayev, an oceanographer with a passion for the deep ocean and its connection to our lives. If you're fascinated by ocean life, today's episode is for you. We talk about how deep-sea science makes its way into global policy, and we explore what life in the deep ocean really looks like, with vivid stories that bring this hidden world to life. You will hear all of this from Professor Anna Metaxas from Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Anna is a deep-sea biologist, explorer, and leading voice in deep-sea biodiversity and policy. Welcome to the show, Anna.
Thank you.
And I want to start by asking you, has there been a time on an expedition when you felt amazed or surprised by what you were seeing?
Sure. I guess there's two times. The first one was the first deep sea expedition I ever was in, and that was in the Bahamas. And we were diving on the Johnson Link submersible of Harbour Branch Oceanographic. And so that submersible actually has a clear plexiglass dome where you sit, where the scientists and the pilots sit. And when you go down, this is my first time, you go down, you can see all around you. As you go down, you slowly, the lights get dimmed. And, you start seeing a very dark blue up above you. And it's really just a little hole, like you're looking up from a porthole if you look straight up. But then what was happening is because the waters in that area is really, really clear, all that bioluminescence starts firing. All these animals are lighting up. And it was really quite amazing. It was like you're flying through space, except you're actually going down into the deep. And so, my gosh, I fell in love there, right there and then. I was totally in love with the deep ocean.
Wow, that sounds amazing.
So that was the first experience I've ever had. The next probably most amazing experience I've ever had was, of course, diving on a hydrothermal vent. And this was on the Alvin submersible. And, I had never been to a vent before. It was my first dive. It was at 9 North, a place in the Eastern Pacific, is Pacific Rise, which actually has emblematic tube worms and mussels, etc., that we think about when we think about hydrothermal vents. And so we're going down and we've been traveling for 2 hours in a very uncomfortable, cramped space. And then we hit the seabed, and there it is, right in front of me. There is this big, several meter, probably 10, 15 meters tall spiral, and there is black smoke or black water coming out from the top, and it's sort of laced with all these spectacular tube worms, that are like 2 meters long. So, wow, I thought, oh my God, this is like one of the best experiences I've ever had.
Wow, those are incredible. Those are hard to beat. Those are some incredible sights.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people have at this point heard about the deep ocean, but what exactly is deep ocean biodiversity, or what do we mean by this, and why is it so important?
Biodiversity in general, of course, encompasses all the different types of animals, all the different species that live in a particular area. And first of all, we call the deep sea as if that's one thing, but it actually isn't. There's so many different types of ecosystems in the deep sea. I've just mentioned a few. I've just mentioned the water column above the seabed at great depths that has a lot of plankton. It has a lot of, jellies. It has a lot of fish and mammals that dive down to great depths. On the seabed, we have things like hydrothermal vents, underwater volcanoes. We have cold seeps. We have just the long, endless abyssal plains, which is just areas of endless mud So there's a lot of different types of habitats. That in itself suggests that, it is a very diverse system. A lot of different species, some of them adapted to live to those particular habitats, either because the pressure is too high or because it's dark. Because the water is too cold, or because the water is too hot if you're in a hydrothermal vent, or toxic metals are spewing out of those vents.
That's wild. Life thriving in mud plains and toxic vents and freezing cold. And yet we've barely even scratched the surface in terms of discovering who's down there, right?
Most of it has not been described. And so though we have some estimates about how many species live in the deep sea, we actually don't know what the number is. It's millions, more than 1 million, maybe less than 10 million, but there is a lot of different species. And probably 95% of the species have not been described or even seen, for that matter. So we actually don't know who they are. So that makes it a little difficult when we think about it. But all this diversity provides all sorts of what are called ecosystem functions. So each one of those species do different jobs in the deep sea. So, for example, if carbon rains from the top, it hits the seabed, that carbon gets eaten, gets processed. Some of it gets sequestered into the sediment away from the carbon cycle forever. Some gets recycled back into water. The same happens with nutrients. Some of those species, like deep water corals, for example, provide three-dimensional structures, so other species can live there. And so each one of those species has a particular job that it does that basically keeps the ocean ecosystem healthy and providing all those things that the ocean provides for us, which is nutrient cycling, carbon cycling, food, oxygen, and all these different things that we hear about. So this is why it is important.
Yeah, and so it sounds like the deep ocean is doing a lot of behind-the-scenes work that we're not aware of, and it's keeping our planet healthy, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And as we know, these ecosystems are actually under threat.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the biggest threats to deep ocean biodiversity?
So at the moment, people don't think about it, but climate change is actually impacting the deep seas. Although, people may think, whoa, how is climate change going to impact something that lives 6,000 meters below the sea surface? It does. And so there's different parts of the ocean where we start seeing warming. There's things like parts of the deep ocean that are losing their oxygen. There are parts of the deep ocean that will become more acidic. So, for example, animals that have shells or corals that can dissolve and sort of be, those populations lost. So all aspects of climate change do touch the deep sea at some point. And the issue there is that most habitats in the deep sea don't experience large fluctuations in conditions. So the animals are generally adapted in conditions being relatively stable. So if those conditions start getting more variable, then the animals have to adapt to that. However, those animals also have very slow responses because they grow more slowly. They're producing less frequently. And so they have lesser ability to respond to fluctuations that they're actually not used to. So climate is a big one. And of course, resource extraction, deep sea mining is not started. It's a potential, it's out there. And so that's also a big threat for regions in the world where mining is to happen, such as the abyssal plains or hydrothermal vents or seamounts.
So with climate change already affecting deep sea life and the possibility of mining on the horizon, can you tell us who's actually in charge of protecting these ecosystems and therefore the biodiversity that inhabits these systems, and maybe what frameworks or agreements exist to help us manage these?
Yeah, so I guess if I can first talk about the Convention on Biological Diversity, is sort of the global overarching convention that was signed back in 1992 in the Rio Earth Summit. It was, 150 governments signed on to the CBD. And that convention was put in place to protect biodiversity, both on land and in the sea and in all waterways. And so this is sort of the overarching pillar, in terms of biodiversity. And over the years, the CBD has evolved. Now we're in a new era. So in 2022, members of the CBD signed the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework.
And can you tell us the purpose of that framework?
That current framework that was put in place was to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. So this is the framework we're working under now. And part of that, there is actually a component that is directly addressing marine environments, and that is ecologically and biologically significant areas. This is an effort that was put together by the CBD, bringing together a lot of different people in different regions of the world to identify, with whatever information was available, important areas ecologically. And so it was not really a management tool. It was more sort of, hey, based on the information that we have, this is an important area for biodiversity.
Very interesting. And these kinds of tools have helped sort of spotlight the ocean, right? But it hasn't always been easy to get marine environments included in global biodiversity frameworks, has it?
It's always been a battle to sort of get in there and, hey, what about that other, 90% of the planet? And certainly the deep ocean was not really thought about in those agreements and those frameworks. And so as part of DOSI, sort of what we're trying to do with DOSI slowly is trying to engage into those processes so that we can bring the deep ocean and its importance to the forefront.
Amazing. And that's actually perfect for my next question, because this is where the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBS or IPBES, comes in. And it's one of the key ways that the assessments that scientists make can be included in decisions that governments make. And this includes information coming from groups like DOSI. So Anna, can you walk us through how that process works and why this intergovernmental panel is so important?
Yeah, so there enters IPBES. So what that is the CBD often requires an assessment of some topic that the COP decides is an important topic.
And sorry to interrupt, the COP stands for the Conference of the Parties, and parties referring to the different countries that are part of the agreement. And can you tell us briefly what that is?
Yeah, that's where, the delegates meet and make decisions about how to proceed, approve frameworks, etc. The COP comes up with topics or programs of works that are, as they're called, that are important that they need to move forward. Okay. For example, what is going on right now is they needed to do a new assessment of global biodiversity. So where are we now? If we're going to have those frameworks moving forward, we need to know what's there. And so what happens is they come up with topics that they're interested in, and then they pass them on to this IPBES,
the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services.
Yeah, IPBES then is a body that makes these kinds of assessments. The process is not political. And then what happens is they get together experts, and those are scientific experts, plus indigenous knowledge holders, and they basically write an assessment on a topic. And that assessment is written based on science.
And by the way, this is a really important opportunity for experts from underrepresented regions and groups to have a voice in shaping biodiversity policy. So once that group comes together, what does that actually look like in action, Anna?
I can speak to the one that I was part of. So the Nexus assessment was looking at interactions between biodiversity, climate, food, health, and water. How would an impact that climate has on biodiversity, how would that affect water resources? Trying to look at those cumulative, more complicated relationships. And so all that information is then synthesized in a very, very large document, and it's all knowledge-based. When that document gets synthesized, there's no politics involved. And then that goes to, IPBES has what are called plenary sessions, right? So it doesn't have COPs, but it has plenary sessions where government representatives come in. Typically for each assessment, they have a sort of a summary for policymakers. And so those policymakers get in a room and they discuss and they edit the summary. That's where sometimes politics gets in. They cannot alter the science. They can alter what stays and what goes in the summary.
And then what happens to that summary?
So then that document that is produced, that assessment that IPBES produces, is then distributed widely to different policymakers, and it's often used to make policy decisions.
Right.
The next COP, the CBD in Panama in November, is going to be discussing some of the best findings, right? So some of those findings go back to COP. A lot of it goes to sort of national and regional policymakers that helps them, then they have a summary of what the science says. And then some of it goes to funders to sort of help them prioritize future calls for funding for different priorities.
I'm curious, you mentioned that you're currently working on an assessment that looks at water, biodiversity, climate, food, and health. If you're able to share, could you give us a quick summary of what that work involved?
The actual assessment has not been released yet, and we can't really talk about it until it's released. But as you can imagine, some of the basic findings that came out and are in the summary for policymakers is that you can't really disentangle all those things, right? So the Nexus approach basically suggests, the bigger suggestion is that you can't just say, I'm going to look at the impacts on biodiversity and try to solve that problem. I'm going to look at climate and try to solve that problem. But every time you do something, then it will affect something somewhere else.
Yeah, because everything is interconnected.
Yeah.
And we don't think about that in our daily life.
We don't think about this in our daily life, but Indigenous peoples do, right? Because Indigenous people, when they think about the earth, it's not one thing. Everything is a circle. Everything is connected. So to me, this is really interesting. We have gone down this path of very specific, targeted approaches, whereas we're going back to it's much more holistic than that.
Right. And this is knowledge that has been held for generations. And now science is catching up, bringing a different type of evidence to what Indigenous communities have long understood, that everything is connected. So the hope is that this understanding can really inform the big decisions that governments are making. It's such an important shift.
Yeah. If I could say one thing about those, at least for the assessment, right? Those assessments try to engage scientists and knowledge holders from all over the world, right? They try to be diverse. Certainly in our assessment, we try deliberately to include people from Africa because typically ECOPs, it's early career professionals, and developing economies don't think that they could contribute or they don't know how to get into it. And so IPES is trying very deliberately, but, can only succeed if people engage. And so I will put a call out. If you listening to this podcast, if you have friends who you think, if you're interested, if you have friends who think would be interested in something like that, it's a good place to engage, to share your knowledge. And again, it could be scientific knowledge, it could be Indigenous knowledge, it can be local knowledge, but that allows for those assessments to be much more diverse and inclusive and give us a very, very different perspective. And there's often calls for those things, call for this kind of expertise.
That's a very important point, and we will link resources to find out how to contribute or learn about the calls for involvement in the show notes.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
So as we wrap up, imagine you could take our listeners on an expedition to any place in the deep ocean. Where would you take them and why?
Wow. That is a tough one. So we often don't think that corals live in the deep sea, but of course they do. Deep-water coral forests. And in some parts of the world, they are even stony corals, so they form reefs. But usually those reefs are not that colorful. What I'm referring to is forests of Gorgonian corals, which are tree-like corals that can grow to be hundreds to thousands of years old. So they can be huge. They can be 2 to 3 meters across, some of them. And they're just spectacular in color. They're pinks and oranges and yellows and bright reds and whites. And often there's sponges amongst them. And so very colorful, very three-dimensional. And because they're three-dimensional, a lot of animals live there. And so you have fishes that are hanging out and octopuses and big rays that come through and sharks. And so there really are gardens, beautiful, beautiful gardens in the deep sea. So if there are divers in the audience, they would be like, think about diving in a soft coral forest, except older, much, much older. So that gives you a sense of awe that, these corals have been here for 1,000 years and here I am. But also extremely colorful and much bigger. So I would take people down there, I think.
Oh my God, that's incredible. That gave me chills. I love it. My first expedition, we actually came across a lot of Gorgonian corals on a seamount.
Yes.
I think at that point, I wasn't so aware about the fact that there were so many corals in the deep ocean, in like the dark, cold, deep sea.
It's fantastic, eh? It's just beautiful. It's beautiful.
Yes, for sure. It's incredible. All right, so we've come to the end of the episode. And for our listeners who are eager to get involved in deep ocean conservation, do you have any other ideas of how people can stay informed and help out?
So, I mean, obviously, this is a DOSI podcast, and I would say, I've seen the Deep-Ocean Stewardship Initiative grow over the years. I would say it's an amazing resource. DOSI has a lot of different working groups, and people can join a working group, and they can do as much as little as they want. They can just receive information, or they can just work hard, go to, conferences, become a delegate for DOSI. But the thing about DOSI is it has a lot of resources and a lot of information that then you can take and use as much as you want. So for example, it has a newsletter, and all those calls for expertise that I just mentioned, they all come through that newsletter. So that's a good place to start. You don't have to have any special qualifications to join DOSI. You just have to be interested in the deep sea, and you can join. And you can be, as I said, a very passive sort of receiver of information, just getting the newsletters. Those newsletters have anything from scientific papers, but they also have conferences that are coming up. They have cool videos or some initiative that is starting or whatever. So there's a lot of different levels of information. And that can sort of allow you to get more information on more networks. And I have to say, I think that over the years, DOSI has grown so much, and now it has a pretty well-respected position in all those global fora, like UN Ocean Conference. Now we're getting into IPBES, and also provides guidance a little bit from different experts on how to get engaged if you want to be engaged. So I would say start there. It's a great resource, and then dig in as much or as little as you want.
Amazing, Anna. Thank you so much. So if you're feeling inspired, start small, sign up for the DOSI newsletter, or join a working group. You don't need to be a scientist, just someone who cares. Thank you so much, Anna, for sharing your knowledge, your stories, and your passion for the deep ocean with us.
Thanks for talking, Michelle.
And thanks to all of you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the podcast, be sure to leave a rating, share, and hit subscribe. You can also find links in the show notes to learn more about DOSI, deep ocean biodiversity, and how to get involved according to everything that we talked about with Anna today. And if you would like to learn more, don't forget to tune into our next episode for a conversation about climate change in the deep ocean. Thank you to our funders, Arcadia, Synchronicity Earth, the Benioff Ocean Science Laboratory, and the University of Southampton for their support. Think Deep is produced by DOSI with support from David Benjamin Sound.